After the divorce, my husband screamed at me, "If you dare date someone, you'll really see who I am." I simply smiled. He had no idea my first love was his boss. I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from, so I can see how far my story has reached. My name is Marlene, and at 65 years old, I thought I knew what rock bottom felt like. I was wrong. The divorce papers had been signed for 3 months when Felix showed up at my apartment again. He had this way of appearing whenever I started to feel like maybe, just maybe, I could breathe again. This time was different, though. This time, he wasn't just angry. He was dangerous. "You think you're free now, don't you?" Felix stood in my doorway, his gray hair disheveled, his eyes bloodshot. He'd been drinking. Again. "You think you can just throw away 32 years of marriage and start fresh?" I kept my hand on the door, ready to slam it shut if needed. My neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, was watering her plants on the balcony next door, close enough to hear if I screamed. That small comfort was all that kept me standing there instead of hiding in my bedroom like I used to do. "Felix, you need to leave. We have nothing left to discuss." He laughed, but there was no humor in it, just bitterness and rage. "Nothing to discuss? What about Elliot? What about the fact that you kept my stepson away from me for years with your lies?" My heart clenched. Elliot, my son, the one person in this world who made all my sacrifices mean something, and the one person Felix had systematically pushed out of my life. Not because he didn't love Elliot, but because he couldn't stand that Elliot existed before him. That Elliot was proof I had a life, had love, before Felix claimed ownership of me. Elliot is 38 years old, Felix. He can make his own decisions about who he wants in his life. Can he? When his own mother won't even tell him who his real father is? Felix's voice dropped to that dangerous whisper I knew too well, the one that meant the real cruelty was coming. "What do you think he'd say if he knew the truth about why you really married me? About how you were so desperate for stability that you abandoned the man you claimed to love?" The words hit their mark. They always did. Felix had perfected the art of finding exactly where I was most vulnerable and pressing until I broke. But something was different this time. Maybe it was the divorce finally being final. Maybe it was the fact that I'd survived 3 months without him telling me what to think, what to feel, what to remember about my own life. "Is that a threat, Felix?" His smile was cold, calculated. "It's a promise, Marlene. You want to be free? Fine. But if you even think about finding someone else, if you dare try to replace what we had, I'll make sure everyone knows exactly who you really are, starting with Elliot." I felt my hands begin to shake, not from fear this time, but from rage. 32 years of this. 32 years of him rewriting my history, making me doubt my own memories, turning my greatest joy, my son, into a weapon against me. "You think you know who I am?" The words came out steadier than I felt. "You think you can control me forever? I know you better than you know yourself." Felix stepped closer, and I could smell the whiskey on his breath. "You're weak, Marlene. You always have been. You chose security over love once, and you'll do it again. You don't have the courage to start over at your age." But as he spoke, something shifted inside me. A memory surfaced, one I'd buried so deep I'd almost convinced myself it never happened. Strong hands holding mine. A voice whispering that I deserved better, that I deserved everything. Eyes that saw me not as someone to be controlled, but as someone to be cherished. "Abram, get out," I said quietly. "What did you say?" "Get out of my apartment. Get out of my life. And if you come here again, if you contact me again, if you so much as drive down my street, I'll call the police." Felix's face turned red. "You'll regret this, Marlene. When you're alone in this pathetic little apartment with your pathetic little life, remember that you chose this. And when I tell Elliot the truth about his father," the truth? Something snapped inside me. "You want to talk about truth? The truth is that you spent our entire marriage trying to erase the best parts of me. The truth is that you were so threatened by the fact that I had a son who wasn't yours, that you made me choose between him and you. The truth is that I was a coward for choosing you." I saw the shock flash across his face. I'd never spoken to him like this, never fought back. For 32 years, I'd absorbed his anger, his manipulation, his need to remake me into someone smaller, someone who wouldn't threaten his fragile ego. "But I'm not that coward anymore," I continued. So here's some truth for you, Felix. The man who fathered Elliot, he was twice the man you'll ever be, and the only regret I have is that I was too scared to see it. Felix's hand shot out toward me, and for a moment I thought he might actually hit me, but Mrs. Patterson cleared her throat loudly from her balcony, reminding us both that we had an audience. He lowered his hand, but his voice was pure venom. If you think you can just move on, you're wrong. If you think anyone will want a dried-up old woman with more baggage than an airport, you're delusional. And if you think I'll let you poison Elliot against me, you're insane. I think, I said, surprising myself with how calm I sounded, that you're scared. You're scared that without me to control, you're just a bitter old man with nothing to show for your life but the wreckage of other people's happiness. I closed the door before he could respond, turned the deadbolt, and slid the chain into place. Then I pressed my back against the door and waited for my heart to stop racing. But it wasn't fear making my heart pound. It was something I hadn't felt in so long I'd forgotten what it felt like. It was hope. Through the door, I heard Felix's footsteps retreating down the hallway. Heard the elevator ding as he left my building, maybe for the last time. And as the silence settled around me, I allowed myself to think about what I'd said. Abram was twice the man Felix would ever be. It was true. It had always been true. And maybe, just maybe, it was time to stop pretending otherwise. Maybe it was time to remember who I used to be before Felix convinced me I was no one at all. 3 days after Felix's ultimatum, I woke up unable to breathe. It started as a tightness in my chest, like someone had wrapped steel bands around my ribcage and was slowly tightening them. I sat up in bed, gasping, my nightgown soaked with sweat despite the cool morning air. My heart was racing so fast I was sure I was having a heart attack. I fumbled for my phone, ready to call 911, when suddenly I could breathe again. The bands around my chest loosened. My heart slowed to something approaching normal. I sat there in my rumpled bed, confused and shaken, wondering what had just happened to me. It happened again 2 hours later while I was making coffee. One moment I was fine, and the next I was gripping the kitchen counter, certain I was dying. The coffee mug slipped from my hands and shattered on the tile floor, the sound making me jump like a gunshot had gone off. This time, I did call someone. Not 911, but Dr. Martinez, my family physician. She'd been after me for years to leave Felix, though she'd never said it directly. She was too professional for that. But I'd seen it in her eyes during appointments when I'd explained away bruises or when my blood pressure readings came back dangerously high. Marlene? Dr. Martinez's voice was warm but concerned when I described what was happening. When did these episodes start? A few days ago. Right after. I paused, not sure how to explain. Right after a confrontation with my ex-husband. I see. Can you come in this afternoon? I'd like to run some tests. But based on what you're describing, this sounds like panic attacks. They can be quite common after traumatic experiences or during major life changes. Panic attacks. The words felt foreign in my mouth. I'd always been the calm one, the one who kept everything together while Felix raged and stormed. I was the one who smoothed things over, who made excuses, who absorbed his anger so it wouldn't spill over onto anyone else. But as I sat in Dr. Martinez's office later that day, watching her kind eyes as she explained what was happening to my body, I began to understand. Think of it as your nervous system finally feeling safe enough to react, she said gently. For years, you were in survival mode. Your body was constantly flooded with stress hormones, constantly on high alert. Now that you're out of that environment, your system is trying to process everything it couldn't process before. But the divorce was 3 months ago, I protested. Shouldn't I be feeling better by now? Dr. Martinez leaned forward slightly. Marlene, you were married for 32 years to someone who controlled you. Your body is learning how to exist without that constant state of tension. It's going to take time. Controlled me. Such a simple way to describe 3 decades of having my thoughts, my feelings, my very memories questioned and reshaped. Felix had been subtle about it, never violent enough to leave marks that couldn't be explained. But he'd been thorough. I thought about the woman I'd been when I married him. I was 33, a single mother trying to make the best life I could for Elliot. I'd been independent, strong, capable of making my own decisions. Felix had seemed like a gift then, stable, financially secure, willing to provide for us both. I hadn't realized he expected complete ownership in return. "Doctor," I said quietly, "how long has it been since I made a decision without wondering what someone else would think?" She didn't answer immediately, just watched me with those perceptive eyes. "What do you think?" I tried to remember. The last time I'd chosen something just because I wanted it. Not because it would keep peace or avoid conflict or meet someone else's expectations. The answer, when it came, made my chest tight again. 33 years, I whispered. It's been 33 years since I was truly loved, and 32 years since I made a choice just for me. The difference between those two numbers wasn't lost on either of us. One beautiful, perfect year when I'd been loved completely, authentically, without conditions or demands for change. One year when someone had looked at me and seen exactly who I was and thought that was enough. Abram. "Tell me about that year," Dr. Martinez said softly. And suddenly, I was 29 again, working at the downtown library, discovering that the quiet man who came in every Tuesday and Thursday to research business journals had noticed me too. Abram was different from every man I'd ever known. He asked questions and actually listened to the answers. He made me laugh. He made me feel interesting, intelligent, worth listening to. When I'd told him I was pregnant with Elliot, he hadn't run. He'd held my hands and asked me what I wanted, what would make me happy. He'd talked about the future like I was an essential part of it, not an obstacle to navigate around. He was building something, I found myself telling Dr. Martinez, a business. He worked constantly, but it wasn't like Felix's work. Felix worked to feel important. Abram worked because he had this vision of the life he wanted to give us. He used to tell me about the house he was going to buy, how Elliot would have his own room and a yard to play in. What happened? The familiar weight of shame settled in my chest. My mother happened. My sister. They said I was being foolish, that Abram was all promises and no action. They said I needed to think about security, about giving Elliot a stable home with a man who was already established, not someone who was chasing dreams. I remembered the night I'd ended it with Abram, the look in his eyes when I'd told him I'd accepted Felix's proposal. He hadn't argued, hadn't tried to change my mind. He'd just looked at me like I was breaking his heart and said, "I hope he makes you happy, Marlene. You deserve to be happy." "Did he?" Dr. Martinez asked. "Make you happy?" I laughed, but it came out broken and bitter. He made me safe, or what I thought was safe. And I convinced myself that was enough. I convinced myself that love, like what Abram and I had, was just fantasy. That real life was about compromise and practicality. And now I was 65 years old, sitting in a doctor's office because my body was finally telling me the truth my mind had been too afraid to acknowledge. I hadn't been safe with Felix. I'd been trapped. And all those years of compromise had been me slowly disappearing, piece by piece, until I barely recognized myself. Now I'm having panic attacks because I can't remember who I am without someone telling me, I said. Now my son barely speaks to me because Felix convinced him I was ashamed of his father. Now I'm alone in a way I've never been alone before. But even as I said it, I realized it wasn't entirely true. Yes, I was alone. But for the first time in decades, that solitude belonged to me. No one was telling me what to think about it, how to feel about it, what it meant about my worth as a person. Dr. Martinez prescribed something mild for the panic attacks and recommended a therapist. As I was leaving, she touched my arm gently. "Marlene, that year when you were truly loved, that wasn't fantasy. That was real. And you were real too. You still are." Walking to my car, I felt another episode starting. The familiar tightness, the racing heart. But this time, instead of fighting it, I sat in my car and let it wash over me. I thought about what Dr. Martinez had said. My body was learning how to exist without constant tension. Maybe my soul was learning the same thing. As the panic subsided, I made a decision. A real decision, made just for me, for the first time in over 30 years. I was going to find out what happened to Abram. That night, I did something I hadn't done in 32 years. I went into my closet and pulled down the old shoebox from the top shelf, the one Felix never knew about. The one I'd hidden behind winter coats and forgotten Christmas decorations, moving it from house to house like a refugee carrying the only proof of home. My hands shook as I lifted the lid. Inside were pieces of a life I'd convinced myself had never really existed. A pressed flower from the first bouquet Abram had given me, a ticket stub from the movie we'd seen on our third date, letters he'd written when he had to travel for business, full of plans and dreams and promises that I'd been too scared to believe, and photos. Oh, the photos. There was one of the three of us, me, Abram, and 2-year-old Elliot, taken at the park near my old apartment. Abram was pushing Elliot on a swing while I watched, laughing at something one of them had said. We looked like a family. We looked happy. We looked real. I'd forgotten how Abram looked at Elliot. Not like Felix, who'd spent years treating my son like an inconvenient reminder of my past. Abram had looked at Elliot like he was a gift, like being chosen to help raise him was an honor, not a burden. In the photo, Elliot's little arms were stretched toward Abram, complete trust written across his toddler face. He'd called Abram Daddy for almost a year before I'd ripped that away from both of them. I sat on my bedroom floor, surrounded by evidence of the life I'd thrown away, and tried to remember exactly how it had happened. How I'd gone from being a woman who felt beautiful and loved and full of possibility to someone who spent 3 decades apologizing for existing. It started with my mother's voice in my head, the same voice that had criticized every choice I'd made since I was old enough to have opinions. Marlene, honey, you have to be practical. That boy is sweet. But what's he offering you? Dreams don't pay rent. Dreams don't put food on the table for Elliot. Then my sister Carol had gotten involved. Carol, who'd married her high school sweetheart and lived in the same house for 20 years, who thought any relationship that involved passion or uncertainty was somehow immoral. You're not 18 anymore, Marlene, she'd said over coffee one morning while Elliot played at our feet. You can't afford to chase fairy tales. Felix is offering you security. A real home. A father for Elliot who's already proven he can provide. I'd tried to explain that Abram was working toward something, that his business was growing, that he had plans, but they'd worn me down with questions I couldn't answer. What if his business failed? What if he decided being a stepfather was too much responsibility? What if I was wrong about him? The doubt they planted grew like a cancer. Every time Abram worked late, I wondered if he was avoiding us. Every time he talked about the future, I wondered if he was making promises he couldn't keep. When Felix proposed after 6 months of steady, predictable courtship, I'd convinced myself it was the mature choice. Looking at that photo now, I could see the truth I'd been too frightened to acknowledge then. Abram hadn't been avoiding responsibility. He'd been working 18-hour days because he was trying to build something worthy of us. His promises hadn't been empty. They'd been the foundation of a future he was constructing with his own hands. And I'd walked away from it because it felt too good to be true. The night I'd told Abram about Felix's proposal was seared into my memory with painful clarity. We'd been sitting on his apartment balcony after putting Elliot to bed. He'd been telling me about a contract he'd landed, how it would finally give him the financial stability to propose properly, to give me the ring and the wedding I deserved. Abram, I'd interrupted, my voice barely above a whisper. I need to tell you something. He'd stopped mid-sentence, already sensing something was wrong. What is it? Felix asked me to marry him, and I said yes. The silence that followed felt endless. Abram didn't rage or plead or try to change my mind. He just looked at me with those warm brown eyes that had always made me feel like I was the most important person in the world and asked, "Is that what you want?" "It's what's best," I'd said, using my mother's words, my sister's logic. For Elliot, for everyone. That's not what I asked. His voice was quiet, careful. Is that what you want, Marlene? I couldn't answer him because I didn't know how to want things anymore. I only knew how to choose what others thought was right, what would cause the least conflict, what would make everyone else comfortable with my decisions. I think it's time for me to go. I'd finally said. Abram had nodded slowly, then leaned over and kissed Elliot's forehead as he slept in his stroller. "Take care of yourself, little man," he'd whispered. Then he'd looked at me one last time. "And you take care of yourself too, Marlene. You deserve to be happy." I'd never seen him again after that night. Within a month, I'd married Felix in a small ceremony that felt more like a business transaction than a celebration. Felix had insisted we move to a different neighborhood, get a fresh start. He'd also insisted that we not discuss my previous entanglements, as he called them. "Elliot needs stability," Felix had said. "He needs to know that I'm his father now. Confusing him with stories about the past isn't fair to him." So I'd stopped talking about Abram. When Elliot asked about his daddy, I'd given vague answers about someone who'd had to go away. As the years passed and Felix's control tightened around us like a noose, those answers became even vaguer, until eventually Elliot stopped asking altogether. Felix had been systematic about erasing my past. He'd convinced me to throw away photos, letters, anything that connected me to who I'd been before him. He'd suggested I cut contact with friends who'd known Abram, claiming they would just remind me of unhealthy attachments. "You're a different person now," he'd told me repeatedly. "A better person, a more mature person. Don't you want to focus on our future instead of dwelling on mistakes?" But the mistake hadn't been loving Abram. The mistake had been believing I didn't deserve that love. Sitting there on my bedroom floor, surrounded by the fragments of my real life, I understood something that made my chest ache with regret. I'd stolen Elliot's father from him. Not just Abram, but the knowledge of who Abram was, what he'd meant to us, how much he'd loved us both. Elliot had grown up believing his biological father was someone I was ashamed of, someone not worth remembering. He didn't know about the man who'd taught him to tie his shoes, who'd read him bedtime stories in 3 different voices, who'd planned to adopt him officially once we were married. Felix had poisoned that well so thoroughly that now, at 38, Elliot barely spoke to me. He thought I was someone who abandoned people, who was ashamed of her own past, who'd chosen a cold, critical man over genuine love. He wasn't entirely wrong about that last part. I picked up one of Abram's letters and read it again. He'd written it from a business trip to Chicago, 3 weeks before I'd ended our relationship. "My darling Marlene," it began, "I know this separation is hard, but I promise it's temporary. Every contract I sign, every deal I close, brings us closer to the life I want to give you and Elliot. I've looked at houses in Riverside. There's one with a big backyard and a swing set already installed. Elliot would love it. And you could have the garden you've always talked about. I know you think I'm a dreamer, but these aren't dreams anymore. They're plans. And you and Elliot are at the center of every single one." I pressed the letter to my chest and cried for everything I'd lost, everything I'd thrown away, everyone I'd hurt with my cowardice. But as the tears subsided, I felt something else stirring inside me, something that felt dangerous and hopeful and absolutely terrifying. Maybe it wasn't too late. Maybe some mistakes could be undone. Maybe some bridges could be rebuilt. I'd spent 32 years living with the consequences of choosing fear over love, but I was still here. I was still breathing. And somewhere out there, if he was still alive, Abram was still breathing too. It was time to find out if the life I'd thrown away was truly gone, or if there was still a chance to choose love this time. Felix's harassment escalated exactly as I'd expected it would. The day after I'd spent the evening reliving my memories of Abram, Felix called 17 times. When I didn't answer, he started showing up, first at my apartment building, standing in the lobby until the security guard asked him to leave. Then at the grocery store, following me through the aisles, muttering loud enough for other shoppers to hear about ungrateful wives and family loyalty. But it was the incident at Dr. Martinez's office that finally pushed me to act. I'd arrived for my follow-up appointment about the panic attacks, and there was Felix, sitting in the waiting room like he belonged there. "What are you doing here?" I'd asked, my voice shaking with a mixture of fear and rage. "Making sure you're getting the help you need," he'd said loudly, performing for the other patients. "Mental health is so important at our age, don't you think? Especially when someone is having difficulties adjusting to reality." The receptionist had looked uncomfortable, and I'd seen other patients glancing between us with obvious concern. Felix was planting seeds, making me look unstable, unreliable. It was exactly the kind of psychological warfare he'd perfected during our marriage. That night, I made the decision that would change everything. I was done being afraid. I was done letting Felix control the narrative of my life. If he wanted to escalate, I'd meet him there. I called the police. Officer Sarah Chen was younger than I'd expected, maybe Elliot's age, with kind eyes and a no-nonsense manner that reminded me of Dr. Martinez. She sat in my living room taking notes as I explained the pattern of harassment. "Mrs. Walsh, I have to be honest with you," she said when I'd finished. "Unless he makes direct threats or violates a specific restraining order, there's not much we can do with phone calls and public encounters." "What about going to his workplace?" I asked. "Could you at least identify him there? Let his employer know that this behavior is unacceptable?" Officer Chen considered this. "We could speak with him, make it clear that further contact with you constitutes harassment. Sometimes that's enough to make someone back down. Where does he work?" "Morrison and Associates. It's a mid-sized consulting firm downtown." "I know it. Would you be willing to come with us?" Sometimes the presence of the complainant makes the warning more effective. My first instinct was to say no. The idea of confronting Felix at his workplace, in front of his colleagues, felt terrifying. But then I thought about the woman in those photographs, the one who'd had the courage to love fully, to dream of better things. That woman wouldn't have hidden in her apartment, waiting for someone else to solve her problems. "Yes," I said. "I'll come." The next afternoon, I sat in the back of the police car, my hands folded tightly in my lap as we pulled up to the gleaming office building that housed Morrison and Associates. Officer Chen had brought her partner, Officer Rodriguez, and they'd briefed me on what would happen. "We'll ask to speak with Felix privately first," Officer Chen explained. "If he's cooperative, that might be enough. If not, we may need you to formally identify him and explain the situation." I nodded, but my heart was racing as we entered the building. The lobby was all marble and glass, designed to impress clients with its expensive elegance. Felix had always been proud of working here, had used it as evidence of his superior judgment, his ability to provide the kind of life I should be grateful for. The elevator ride to the 15th floor felt endless. When the doors opened, we were greeted by a receptionist who looked flustered at the sight of two police officers. "We need to speak with Felix Walsh," Officer Rodriguez said, showing his badge. "It's regarding a civil matter." "Oh," the receptionist said, her eyes wide. Let me get Mr. Morrison. He'll want to know." She disappeared down a hallway, and within minutes, a distinguished man in his 60s appeared. He had silver hair and the kind of authoritative presence that suggested he was used to being in charge. "Officers, I'm David Morrison. How can I help you?" "We need to speak with one of your employees, Felix Walsh, regarding a harassment complaint." Mr. Morrison's expression grew serious. "I see. Felix is in a client meeting, but I can pull him out if this is urgent." "That would be helpful," Officer Chen said. As Mr. Morrison walked away to get Felix, I stood in the reception area trying to calm my nerves. The walls were lined with photos of the company's history, achievements, major projects. It was then that I saw it. A large photograph from what looked like a company anniversary party. Dozens of people in formal wear, all smiling at the camera. And there, in the back row, taller than most of the others, was a face that made my heart stop beating. Abram. He was older, of course. His dark hair was now silver at the temples, and there were lines around his eyes that hadn't been there 33 years ago. But it was definitely him. The same strong jaw, the same gentle eyes, the same slight smile that had always made me feel like I was the only person in the world who mattered. I must have made a sound, because Officer Chen looked at me with concern. "Mrs. Walsh, are you all right?" I couldn't answer. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't process what I was seeing. Abram worked here. Abram worked at the same company as Felix. For how long? Did they know each other? Did Felix know who Abram was? The sound of voices approaching snapped me back to reality. Felix was walking down the hallway with Mr. Morrison, his face already twisted with irritation. "This is ridiculous," Felix was saying. "I have no idea why." He stopped mid-sentence when he saw me. "What the hell is she doing here?" "Mr. Walsh," Officer Rodriguez stepped forward. "We're here to discuss the harassment complaint filed against you by your ex-wife." "Harassment?" Felix's voice was loud, indignant. I haven't harassed anyone. I've been trying to maintain contact with someone who's clearly having mental health issues. That's exactly the kind of behavior we're here to address, Officer Chen said calmly. Mrs. Walsh has documented multiple instances of unwanted contact, following, and public confrontation. As the officers began explaining the situation to Felix, I found myself staring past them, down the hallway where more employees had begun to gather, drawn by the commotion. And then I saw him. Abram stepped out of an office at the far end of the hall, probably wondering about the disturbance. For a moment, he was just looking in our direction with mild curiosity. Then his eyes found mine. The recognition was instant and mutual. I watched as his expression shifted from confusion to shock to something that looked almost like pain. He took a step forward, then stopped, seeming to realize this wasn't the time or place for whatever reunion this might be. But he was here. After 33 years, after a lifetime of wondering and regret, Abram was standing 50 feet away from me. Do you understand, Mr. Walsh? Officer Rodriguez was saying. This is insane, Felix replied, but his voice had lost some of its bluster. I work here. I have a reputation to maintain. You can't just come in here and— We can, and we will, Officer Chen said firmly. Any further contact with Mrs. Walsh will result in formal charges. That includes phone calls, visits to her residence, following her in public, or any other form of contact. Felix's face was red with rage and embarrassment. I could see his colleagues watching from doorways and around corners, and I knew this public humiliation would eat at him far more than any legal consequences. Fine, he said through gritted teeth. But don't come crying to me when she has another breakdown. Don't come crying to me when she realizes what she's thrown away. The only thing I threw away, I said, surprising myself by speaking up, was 32 years of my life trying to make you happy. I won't be throwing away anymore. Felix turned to stare at me, shock replacing anger on his face. In all our years together, I'd never spoken to him like that in public. I'd never challenged him in front of witnesses. But my eyes weren't on Felix anymore. They were on Abram, who had moved closer during the confrontation and was now standing near Mr. Morrison. Our eyes met across the crowded hallway, and for just a moment, it was like 33 years collapsed into nothing. He was real. He was here. And unless I was imagining things, the way he was looking at me suggested that he remembered too. Officer Chen was wrapping up the conversation with Felix, explaining the legal consequences of violating the no-contact warning. Mr. Morrison was assuring them that the company would not tolerate any workplace disruption related to personal matters. But all I could think about was the fact that somewhere in this building, Abram had an office. Somewhere in this building was the man I'd spent 3 decades trying to forget. The man whose memory had been the only thing that made me feel human during the darkest years of my marriage. As we prepared to leave, I caught one more glimpse of him. He was still watching me, and when our eyes met this time, he nodded slightly. Just once. Like he was acknowledging that he'd seen me, that he knew this wasn't a coincidence, that maybe this moment meant something to him too. Walking back to the police car, my legs felt unsteady. Officer Chen asked if I was all right, and I managed to nod and thank them for their help. But inside, I was reeling. Felix worked for Abram, or maybe with him. The man who had spent over 30 years trying to erase my past had been sharing office space with the most important part of that past this entire time. The irony was so perfect, so completely unexpected, that I almost laughed. Instead, I sat in the back of that police car and wondered what on earth I was supposed to do with this impossible gift the universe had just handed me. I didn't sleep that night. How could I? Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Abram's face, older, but still so familiar, still capable of making my heart race like I was 29 again. By morning, I'd convinced myself that going back to that office building would be crazy, desperate, pathetic. I went anyway. I told myself I was just curious about whether Felix would respect the police warning. I told myself I needed to see if he'd cause trouble at work that might reflect poorly on me somehow. I told myself a dozen lies as I sat in the coffee shop across the street from Morrison & Associates, watching the building like some kind of stalker. What I was really doing was hoping for another glimpse of the man I'd never stopped loving. At exactly 11:30, Abram emerged from the building. Thou. He looked around briefly, then started walking directly toward the coffee shop, toward me. My heart hammered against my ribs as he pushed through the door and scanned the interior. When his eyes found mine, he smiled, the same gentle, slightly uncertain smile I remembered from 33 years ago. "I was hoping you'd be here," he said, sliding into the chair across from me. "How did you know I would be?" "Because I know you," he said simply. "Or I knew you. You were never one to leave things unfinished." We sat there for a moment, just looking at each other. Up close, I could see the changes that time had made. The lines around his eyes were deeper, and his hair was more silver than brown now. But his hands were the same, strong, calloused from the work he'd always been proud of. And his eyes were exactly as I remembered them, warm and intelligent and kind. "You look beautiful," he said quietly. I almost laughed. "I look old. You look like Marlene." "My Marlene." He paused, seeming to catch himself. "I mean, you look like yourself. The way I remember you." The words hung between us, heavy with all the years and regrets and what-ifs that separated then from now. "I can't believe you work there," I said finally. "With Felix. Do you know who he is?" Abram's expression grew complicated. "I've known for about 5 years. He never knew who I was to you, but I recognized the name when he started talking about his divorce. Walsh was your married name, wasn't it?" I nodded. "But how? How did you end up working at the same company?" "I bought it," Abram said matter-of-factly. "Morrison and Associates. David Morrison wanted to retire, and I'd been looking for an acquisition that would round out my business portfolio. I had no idea Felix worked there until after the deal was done." "You bought the company?" I stared at him. "What kind of business do you have?" Abram looked almost embarrassed. "Construction, mostly. Commercial development. Some residential projects. I started small after you married Felix. Threw myself into work because I didn't know what else to do with myself. The pieces started falling into place. You built the business you were always planning to build. I built the life I was going to give you," he said softly. "Even after you were gone, I couldn't seem to stop. It was like I was still trying to prove to you that I could provide, that I could be the man you needed." The words hit me like a physical blow. All those years, while I was making myself smaller and smaller to fit into Felix's world, Abram had been building the future he'd promised me. The future I'd been too scared to believe in. "Abram," I whispered, my voice breaking. "I made such a terrible mistake." "Hey." He reached across the table and took my hand, and the touch sent electricity through my entire body. "You did what you thought was best for Elliot. I understood that then, and I understand it now. But it wasn't what was best. Felix made Elliot's life miserable. He made my life miserable, and I swallowed hard. "He made sure Elliot never knew about you. Elliot thinks his father was someone I was ashamed of, someone not worth remembering." Abram's grip on my hand tightened. "What does Elliot know? Nothing. Less than nothing. Felix convinced me that talking about you would confuse him, that it was better for him to think of Felix as his father. And I was so young, so scared of making another mistake, that I went along with it. And now? Now Elliot's 38 years old and barely speaks to me. He thinks I'm someone who abandons people, who chooses convenience over love. He's not entirely wrong." Abram was quiet for a long moment, his thumb tracing gentle circles on the back of my hand. "Marlene, can I ask you something?" I nodded. "Did you ever think about me? During all those years?" The question broke something open inside me. "Every day," I admitted. "Every single day. When Elliot learned to ride a bike, I thought about how you would have been there cheering him on. When he graduated high school, I thought about how proud you would have been. When he got married, I stopped, unable to continue. When he got married, Felix wouldn't let me invite you. Not that I even knew where you were, but Felix made it clear that any mention of Elliot's biological father would be inappropriate. So I sat at my son's wedding, watching him dance with the man who'd spent years making him feel like a burden, and I thought about you. I thought about how it should have been you walking him down the aisle. Abram closed his eyes briefly, and when he opened them, they were bright with unshed tears. I thought about him too. Wondered what kind of man he'd become. Wondered if he looked like you, or if he had my stubborn streak. He has your hands, I said without thinking. And your laugh. And this way of tilting his head when he's thinking hard about something. You remember things like that about me? I remember everything about you. I tried not to, but I couldn't forget. Felix used to get so angry when he'd catch me staring off into space. He said I was living in fantasies, that I needed to focus on reality. But you weren't a fantasy. What we had wasn't a fantasy. Abram brought my hand to his lips and kissed it gently. No, it wasn't. We sat there in silence for a while, both of us processing the magnitude of what we'd lost, what we'd found, what might still be possible. Finally, Abram spoke again. Marlene, I need to tell you something about Felix. My stomach clenched. What about him? Yesterday, after the police left, David Morrison called me into his office. He was concerned about the disruption, wanted to discuss Felix's employment status. Is Felix going to be fired? Not immediately. But David's been looking for reasons to let him go for a while now. Felix's work has been problematic. He's alienated several clients with his attitude, and there have been complaints from other employees about his behavior. I thought about Felix's ultimatum, his threats, his certainty that he could control my life indefinitely. He always said his job was secure, that he was indispensable. He's not. And now that there's been a police incident involving harassment, David's going to start building a case for termination. It might take a few months, but Felix's days at Morrison & Associates are numbered. The irony was almost too much to process. Felix, who had destroyed my relationship with Abram out of jealousy and control, was now going to lose his job because of his behavior toward me. And the man making that decision was the same man Felix had unknowingly driven away from me 33 years ago. There's something else, Abram continued. David's retiring next year. He's offered to sell me his remaining stake in the company. I'd be the sole owner. Which means you'd be Felix's boss. Which means I could make sure he never bothers you again. The quiet certainty in his voice made me shiver. This wasn't the young man I'd known, full of dreams and promises. This was someone who had spent 3 decades building real power, real influence, someone who could actually protect me in ways that 29-year-old Abram never could have. Abram, I said carefully, what are you thinking? He smiled, and for the first time, it wasn't entirely gentle. I'm thinking that sometimes the universe has a sense of justice. I'm thinking that maybe it's time for Felix to experience what it feels like to have his life controlled by someone else's decisions. And what about us? The question slipped out before I could stop it. Abram's expression grew serious again. What about us, Marlene? What do you want there to be about us? I looked at this man who had loved me completely when I was young and scared and making terrible decisions, who had built the life he'd promised me even after I'd thrown his love away. Who was looking at me now like 33 years was just a long weekend we'd spent apart. I want to try again, I said. I want to find out who we could have been, who we still might be. Abram smiled, and this time it was pure joy. I was hoping you'd say that. He stood up and came around to my side of the table, offering me his hand. Would you like to go see that house I told you about? The one with the big backyard and the swing set? I never did sell it. 3 months later, I stood in the kitchen of the house Abram had bought for us 33 years ago, watching him make coffee the way he used to on Sunday mornings. The swing set was still in the backyard, weathered but sturdy, waiting for grandchildren who might someday play on it. Moving in with Abram hadn't been a decision I'd made lightly. We'd spent weeks talking, remembering, rebuilding trust that had been shattered by time and circumstances. But some connections run too deep to be destroyed completely. And what we'd had was apparently one of them. The house was everything he'd promised it would be. Spacious but warm, with a garden where I'd already started planting vegetables and herbs, windows that let in light without judgment, rooms that felt like home instead of a museum of someone else's expectations. But the most beautiful part was watching Abram with Elliot. My son had been skeptical when I'd first told him about finding Abram again. 38 years of believing his father was someone shameful had left deep scars. But Abram had been patient, gentle, willing to let Elliot set the pace for their relationship. The breakthrough had come 2 weeks ago, when Elliot brought his 5-year-old daughter Sophie to meet us. She'd taken one look at the swing set and demanded someone push her. Before I could move, Abram was striding across the yard, his face lit up with the same joy I remembered from when Elliot was small. "Higher, Grandpa Abram," Sophie had squealed, using the title without any prompting from the adults. I'd watched Elliot's face as he saw his daughter being cherished by the man who should have been in his life all along. Watched him recognize something in Abram's gentle patience, his genuine delight in Sophie's chatter. Watched the moment when 30 years of questions finally got their answers. "He's nothing like what I expected," Elliot had told me later. "Felix always made it sound like my biological father was irresponsible, selfish, but Abram, Mom, he kept pictures of me, from when I was little. He's been carrying them in his wallet for 33 years. That conversation had led to others. Long talks where I finally told Elliot the truth about why I'd left Abram, about the pressure from my family, about my own fear and inexperience, about how Felix had systematically erased his father from our lives. It hadn't been easy. Elliot was angry. At me for my cowardice. At Felix for his manipulation. At the whole situation that had robbed him of his real father for so many years. But he was also healing. And for the first time since his childhood, he was calling me regularly, bringing Sophie over for dinners, building the relationship we should have had all along. The coffee maker beeped, pulling me back to the present. Abram handed me a mug, then wrapped his arms around me from behind, resting his chin on my shoulder. "Penny for your thoughts?" "Just thinking about how different everything is," I said, leaning back against his chest. "How different I am." "You're not different," he murmured into my hair. "You're just yourself again, the way you were always meant to be." My phone buzzed on the counter. A text from Elliot. "Sophie wants to know if Grandpa Abram can teach her to build a birdhouse this weekend. Fair warning, she's very specific about her architectural requirements." I showed Abram the message, and his face lit up with that same joy I'd been rediscovering in him daily. "Tell him yes, and tell him to bring his toolbox. Sophie should learn to use real tools." As I was typing back, another message came through, this one from a number I didn't recognize. "Marlene, this is David Morrison. Could you call me when you have a chance? It's about Felix." Abram saw my expression change. "What is it?" I showed him the message. We'd been expecting this call for weeks. David Morrison's voice was carefully professional when I called him back. "Marlene, I wanted to let you know that we terminated Felix's employment this morning. There was an incident with a client yesterday that was the final straw." "What kind of incident?" "He became verbally aggressive when the client questioned one of his recommendations, used some very inappropriate language, and made what could be construed as threats. We can't have that kind of behavior representing our company." I felt a mix of satisfaction and something that might have been pity. Felix had always been his own worst enemy, but his need to control everyone around him had finally destroyed the one thing he'd valued most, his professional reputation. "I wanted you to know," David continued, "that this had nothing to do with the harassment complaint. This was purely about job performance and professional conduct. But I also wanted to assure you that he's been instructed not to return to the building for any reason." After I hung up, Abram and I sat in silence for a moment. Felix's termination meant more than just the end of his career at Morrison & Associates. At 67, with a reputation for being difficult, he was unlikely to find comparable employment elsewhere. The comfortable lifestyle he'd built, the prestige he'd coveted, the financial security he'd used to justify his behavior, all of it was gone. "How do you feel about it?" Abram asked quietly. I considered the question. A year ago, I would have felt guilty, responsible somehow. I would have worried about Felix's well-being, wondered if I should offer help. That was the woman Felix had trained me to be. Someone who absorbed responsibility for everyone else's choices and consequences. But I wasn't that woman anymore. "I feel free," I said finally. "For the first time in 33 years, I feel completely free." That afternoon, Abram and I were working in the garden when I saw a familiar car drive slowly past the house. Felix's silver sedan, moving at a crawl, the driver staring at our house with obvious malice. "Should I call the police?" I asked, but Abram shook his head. "Let him look," he said calmly, not even glancing up from the tomato plants he was staking. "Let him see what happiness looks like." The car made another pass, then another. On the fourth pass, it stopped altogether. Felix got out and stood on the sidewalk, staring at us with an expression of pure rage and disbelief. I felt the familiar flutter of panic starting in my chest, but Abram's steady presence beside me kept it from taking hold. This was my life now. My garden, my home, my choice. Felix had no power here. "Marlene!" Felix called out, his voice sharp with desperation. "We need to talk." Abram straightened up slowly, his hands still gentle on the plants, but his posture suddenly protective. "No, you don't," he called back, his voice carrying easily across the yard. "You need to leave." "Who the hell are you?" Felix demanded, finally seeming to register that I wasn't alone. Abram smiled, and it was the most dangerous expression I'd ever seen on his kind face. "I'm Abram Chen, the owner of Morrison & Associates, and the father of Elliot Walsh." I watched the color drain from Felix's face as the implications hit him. The man who'd just fired him was the same man he'd been jealous of for 33 years. The man he'd tried to erase from his stepson's life was now the center of his ex-wife's world. The perfect irony of it all seemed to hit Felix like a physical blow. He stood there for a moment, swaying slightly, before getting back in his car and driving away. He didn't come back. 6 months later, I was sitting on our front porch, watching Sophie chase butterflies in the garden, when Abram joined me with 2 glasses of lemonade. "Elliot called," he said, settling into the chair beside me. "He and Maria want to bring the baby here for Christmas. First Christmas as a family of 4. I smiled, thinking about the grandchild who would grow up knowing both his grandfathers, who would hear stories about the great love that brought his family back together, instead of the shame and secrets that had defined my relationship with Elliot for so many years. "Any word from Felix?" Abram asked, though we both knew the answer. I shook my head. After losing his job, Felix had retreated into bitter isolation. He'd moved to a small apartment across town, spending his days writing angry letters to former colleagues and nursing his grievances. I'd heard through mutual acquaintances that he'd become one of those bitter old men who blamed everyone else for his circumstances, who insisted the world had conspired against him. He was right, in a way. The world had conspired against him, but not in the way he thought. The world had simply given him exactly what he'd earned, the same loneliness and powerlessness he'd inflicted on others for decades. "Do you ever feel sorry for him?" Abram asked. I thought about it honestly. Sometimes, but then I remember that he made his choices, just like I made mine. The difference is that I got a second chance to choose love over fear. He's still choosing bitterness over growth. Abram took my hand, intertwining our fingers the way he used to when we were young. "No regrets?" I looked around at the life we'd built together, the home filled with laughter, the family reunited, the garden blooming with possibilities. At 65, I was finally living the life I was meant to live, with the man I was meant to love. "Only one," I said, "that it took me so long to find my way back to you." Abram brought my hand to his lips and kissed it softly. Sometimes the best things are worth waiting for. As the sun set over our garden, painting the sky in shades of hope and promise, I knew he was right. Some love is so deep, so true, that it can survive decades of separation and still burn bright. Some mistakes can be forgiven, some bridges can be rebuilt, some stories can have happy endings even when they start with heartbreak. And sometimes the people who try to destroy your happiness end up destroying only themselves, while you discover that the life you thought you'd lost forever was just waiting for you to be brave enough to claim it. Felix had threatened that I would know him for real if I dared to find someone new. He was right about that too. I did get to know him for real. I learned that he was exactly what he'd always appeared to be. A small, frightened man who mistook control for love and possession for partnership. But I also got to know myself for real. And what I learned was that I was stronger than I'd ever imagined, braver than I'd ever believed, and worthy of the kind of love that builds rather than destroys. The greatest revenge, I realized, wasn't hurting Felix back. It was living so fully, so joyfully, so authentically that his attempts to diminish me became nothing more than echoes of a past I'd finally outgrown. It was choosing love, at last and forever, and discovering that love had been waiting patiently for me all along. Now, I'm curious about you who listened to my story. What would you do if you were in my place? Have you ever been through something similar? Comment below, and meanwhile, I'm leaving on the final screen 2 other stories that are channel favorites, and they will definitely surprise you. Thank you for watching until here.